In its season premiere, In the Life outs the hidden agenda. Airing secret tapes,
we will be the most powerful political force in American politics.
A right-wing hit list.
It is scientific McCarthyism.
And the true goals of the gay rights movement.
I'm going to be out, and I'll just have to see how it goes.
And Harvey goes in search of the homosexual agenda.
It's hard to imagine how we as a community get anything positive done.
All this and more on America's gay and lesbian news magazine, In the Life.
In the Life is funded in part by the H. Van Ameringen Foundation. Additional support provided by the Ford Foundation, the Gill Foundation, the Pride Foundation, the Arcus Foundation, Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS, and the annual support of In the Life members like you.
Welcome to In the Life. I'm Alan Cumming. Tonight, in the premiere episode of its 13th season, America's gay and lesbian news magazine looks into the veiled recesses of the culture wars, casting a light on the covert efforts of a group of religious fundamentalists whose stated objective is to be the most powerful political force in this nation. We'll also be looking for the through line in the homosexual agendas of LGBT Americans. Tonight, in The Hidden Agenda, In the Life delves into God and country.
If we could have people of faith on the school board, we will change this culture.
Life, liberty, etc.
There's so much in this world about getting people to feel lesser than, and it starts so young.
And the secret lives of school boards. In the early 1990s, the newly formed Christian Coalition launched a coordinated crusade to forge a new political order from the bottom up, starting with the nation's school boards. Tonight, in Hostile Takeover, In the Life looks at a New Hampshire community's school board battle and outs the training tapes of the political machine behind it.
Christians founded this nation, they built this nation, and for 300 years they governed this nation. We can govern again. And that's why I founded the Christian Coalition.
Our public schools are a center for indoctrination for the gay agenda.
Well, we believe in activism up and down the line.
What is the mission of the organization? It's simply this: to restore godly principles and godly men and women to the government of the United States of America.
If you want to have political control and you can't win on the issues, you have to go on demonizing people.
I don't think that there was anything Christian about what they were doing.
Merrimack is a white-collar, fairly affluent community in southern New Hampshire.
We've got all the good things, but some of the bad things that you also see in communities throughout America. I don't think before this agenda came into place that we were any different from most communities.
In 1993, I was the incumbent chairman of our school board, and that was during a time in which the Christian Coalition were making a effort to focus on school board races, and particularly in New Hampshire.
We will develop the ability to elect majorities in the United States Congress and the legislatures in at least 30 states, as well as the city councils, the city school boards, and other local bodies.
Part of what we do is to encourage people to get involved in politics at the most basic level. And if God speaks to you about participating, then run for office, run for election. And we'll give you whatever training, whatever education, whatever we can do to help.
If we execute this in the coming 10 years, we will be the most powerful political force in American politics.
There was a lot of negative things that were being targeted towards me and a lot of money that seemed to be coming in from outside the town. I had an ad put in the paper where somebody had forged my signature saying I was selling assault weapons, and it was obviously done in the hopes of discrediting me.
I went to a school board meeting, And it was the most surreal experience I've ever had, because here were 5 people that were elected to run our schools, and they were contemplating bringing in the Lord's Prayer into school. And they were just talking about things that had nothing to do with education. And so I decided to run the following year.
If we could have people of faith on the school board, we will change this culture. We'll change our public schools. We'll change the mindset, the culture that our children are growing up in. Because they're growing up in a very permissive, amoral environment. And we need to have people of faith who will go in there and select good curriculum.
It's been a number of years since they concentrated on global education, on multicultural education, and those would sound good if you didn't know what they meant. But they're really code words for teaching the child that first of all, that all cultures are equal and entitled to respect, and secondly, that the American or the Judeo-Christian is the worst. Now, those are just plain lies, and all cultures are not equal. And to try to mislead children into believing that all cultures are worthy of respect is simply teaching them a falsehood.
Part of their strategy was to look at school boards as a stepping stone, a kind of political grassroots to building up a political establishment. And New Hampshire was a very, very critical place to do that in because of the First in the Nation primary.
The mission of the Christian Coalition is simple: to mobilize Christians one precinct at a time, one community at a time, one state at a time, until once again we are the head and not the tail, and at the top rather than the bottom of our political system.
One of the other tapes has Pat Robertson there talking very deliberately on how this political machine they were building was going to target school boards and target local communities, and he lays out in great detail, having local area captains that will go in and be the organizers of these communities.
They will be responsible for training activists in their region, interfacing with candidates at the local, state, and federal level, and mobilizing people at the grassroots. Each of those regional directors in each of those 7 states will have 10 top counties, targets, where they have to organize down into the precincts by the next election.
We were facing high class sizes, severe overcrowding in our schools. Our teachers were among the lowest paid in this region, and those issues weren't being addressed. Issues that were being addressed were bringing creationism into the science curriculum, introducing a policy, infamously known as Policy 6540, which was going to ban any positive reference to gays and lesbians. So, for example, Walt Whitman, his works would not be able to be perceived in a positive light or promoted in the classroom if the teacher mentioned that he was a gay person. Any type of situation where homosexuality was going to be viewed in a positive way was going to be banned.
I never heard the word homosexual until I was out of graduate school, and I don't think I suffered from that.
The phrase that they use is that homosexuality is normal and healthy, and that is a flat-out, bold-faced lie.
They were focused on things like putting in an anti-gay policy in a community that never had any significant issues with homosexuality in our school district. I think 80 or 90% of America would say they support traditional family values. I think when you get into the details, though, of what the ultra-right Christian political groups support is not what mainstream America supports in family values.
America, a nation founded by Christians and built upon biblical values, is in danger of losing its proud heritage of national greatness through moral strength.
I think the real motivation of extremist groups are complete power and control to meet their own ends. I don't think they look for the well-being of a community at large. In Merrimack, a lesson that we've learned is that we can't afford ourselves the luxury of apathy. Outsiders were trying to implement their own agenda by using our town. I don't expect that this type of agenda has gone away.
There are those in power in our country who would be very happy if the gay community just disappeared. In fact, they'd be very happy if it at least didn't show up at the polls this year. It's very important that you do. Make sure you show up and you vote. Our lives and our liberties are on the line. No joke. This year, more than ever, get out and vote.
Due to the vagaries of textbook manufacturing, the state of Texas largely determines which textbooks will guide the curricula of all of America's public schools. To be more precise, the very few Texans who show up at the state's hearings largely determine which textbooks will guide the curricula of all of America's public schools. In By the Book, In the Life looks at just who is testifying in Texas. In years past, textbook publishers would submit books to the Texas State School Board, and the religious right would line up to battle against them, claiming a liberal bias. But the tables have turned, as this year's book adoption attests. Health textbooks, teaching an abstinence-only curriculum.
88% of people who took virginity pledges reported having sexual intercourse before they married. That is a worse failure rate than condoms.
My argument is if you look in the public schools, you will find children that are going to be abstinent until marriage. It's realistic because it happens all the time.
You know, firefighters promote prevention all the time, but they need the tools to fight their fires. And if we don't give these kids the tools to fight the sexual fires they start, that's why we have so many teen pregnancies in Texas and such a high infection rate.
Young people need to be aware of their bodies, understand their bodies. They need to be proud of their bodies, and they need to be able to make good decisions.
Decisions made in the Texas textbook hearings have a nationwide impact. Because Texas represents such a large portion of the national market, about 10%, textbook publishers tend to respond to their every whim.
Texas wields a big stick when it comes to textbooks, and it also has an impact nationwide. We're very unique. We have an endowment fund that this board manages. It's almost $20 billion in size. Much smaller school populations, they don't have a central purchasing. They're not going to write a textbook for those states. So generally what Texas adopts, so goes the nation.
Texas school board hearings have a legendary history of controversy. At the 2003 hearings, they battled over a biology textbook that didn't teach creationism as well as evolution. In 2002, a history textbook was pulled because it referenced the amount of prostitution that existed on the western frontier. But the keystone textbook battle occurred in 1994, when another health textbook was up for adoption that included education on sexuality and AIDS prevention. Samantha Smoot heads the organization Texas Freedom Network.
One of the reasons this organization was born was because of the incredible controversy over the textbook hearings on health textbooks 10 years ago. And at that time, board members demanded that upwards of 700 changes be made to the books. People complained about things like a line drawing of the female breast in a section on breast cancer and self-breast exams. The political climate was so controversial that one publisher, Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, actually had to pull their book from the adoption process. Their book at the time was the most comprehensive book when it came to sexuality education.
This year, the very same company has submitted a new health textbook. And, like all the other books competing for adoption, it teaches abstinence only, with no mention of condoms whatsoever.
All the new 2005 health books submitted for adoption in Texas come self-censored, pre-censored by the authors and publishers to appeal to the Texas market. All the books purposefully omit these topics, thus continuing the propagation of ignorance among young adults in Texas.
These books are totally different from the health books adopted 7, 8 years ago. And one of the key differences is they've flip-flopped from being more on the liberal side to the conservative side. Why did the publishers do that? I think it's fascinating that they've jumped on the conservative side. I think it shows the nature of the state.
In the 1970s, the religious right, as we know it today, was a cultural force, but it was not a political force. And the religious right used the Reagan years to build an infrastructure, organizing precinct by precinct and church by church, with very modern political tactics.
The year I was elected in 1992, that was one, what you might call a religious right or right-wing person on the board. He was elected the same year that I was elected, and that was just one. His mission, as you learn later, was to get other people to run, and the next round of votes saw 2 people elected to the board. And after that, the process has evolved, and every year, more and more elected to the board.
I happen to believe personally that in this day and age, the most important life-saving piece of information a teenager can walk out of health class with is that at whatever age they become sexually active, they need to wear a condom each and every time.
Give me a quick update on another big issue that y'all were involved in education. The California District Court that tried to remove the Pledge of Allegiance from the classrooms, and y'all were in support of that.
Come on, dude.
I'd just like an update.
And might I congratulate you, Mr. Bradley, on the charges being thrown out this week as well. We already have the highest teen birth rate in the country. If these textbooks pass and go into the classrooms, we're talking about tens of thousands of young people having absolutely no access to information. Also, these books are going to be in classrooms for up to a decade. This is a whole generation of young people we're talking about here.
Diane Hensley of the Collaborative Abstinence Project fought for the abstinence-only curriculum.
Representing my organization, I am here because I felt an obligation to the publishers who I think have done a wonderful job. I was here 9 years ago throwing grenades at them, and I felt a moral obligation to come back and say, good job. These textbooks are excellent. This time around, 2 publishers contacted me pre-publication to see if I'd like to consult. And so that was really a blessing and great progress. And actually, it was interesting because I found myself telling them, you need to add this in. And so that was a real interesting turnaround, that they had become more conservative than I am.
The textbook publishing companies involved declined to be interviewed for this show. Joe Bill Watkins is a partner in the law firm which represents several of the publishing companies.
It's a business. You don't invest hundreds of millions of dollars in hopes that you can offend everybody that you're coming to. My clients respond to what the marketplace says it wants.
Holt Reinhardt Winston hired Dr. Joe McElhaney to write their textbook's abstinence-only section. McElhaney established the Medical Institute for Sexual Health to, among other things, distribute abstinence pamphlets, conduct abstinence seminars, and distribute abstinence-only videos to teenagers.
Abstinence isn't a dirty word. Abstinence isn't a dirty word. Abstinence isn't a dirty word. Self-control. Self-control.
Condoms reduce the risk of HIV by only 85%. It leaves a 15% relative risk of being infected with a fatal disease, even if you use them 100% of the time. And even if you use them 100% of the time, it only reduces the risk of chlamydia and gonorrhea and syphilis and herpes by 50%.
I don't understand why he would be talking and preaching against condom use. You know, nothing is 100%, but abstinence. But we certainly feel that when correctly and appropriately used, that condoms are more than 80 or 90% effective.
It's all sex. Oral sex. Anal sex. Mutual masturbation. Oral sex. It's all sex. Vaginal sex. It's all sex.
In 2002, Dr. McElhaney was appointed by George W. Bush to the Presidential Council on HIV/AIDS.
This is a condom. This is a condom. Condoms are virtually useless against HPV.
At a time when the one thing we need people to know is that if you're going to be sexually active, you need to use a condom every time to try to stop the AIDS epidemic. We've got a guy who's got a national platform for saying, oh, don't bother using condoms, they're not going to work.
And many people say, oh, Dr. Eldridge, you know, condoms will break. But I can assure you that the vows of abstinence break far more easily than those latex condoms.
The textbook hearings in Texas are still underway, and citizen involvement is crucial because, as we've seen, local politics might seem insignificant, but they have nationwide repercussions. In the fall of 2003, In the Life ran a story chronicling what seemed to be a ghost-coordinated attack on the funding of several HIV/AIDS organisations and researchers. Not long after, a staffer leaked a right-wing religious organisation's secret blacklist to the press and put a whole new spin on the funding crisis.
HIV prevention messages like these have made the Stop AIDS Project of San Francisco a target. Stop AIDS was investigated and audited for 14 solid months by the federal government.
We know that 20 years into the epidemic, what it takes to catch the eye of a guy walking down Castro Street is liable to raise an eyebrow in Washington.
There are certain restrictions put on our funding by the United States Congress. One of them, which specifically says that federal funds cannot be used to directly promote sexual activity.
Stop AIDS was eventually cleared. Its materials and workshops were not found to be promoting sex. Still, the organization became a lightning rod in a firestorm raging between liberal safe sex messages and a conservative administration.
The audits and the investigations have been about politics and not about public health.
And many scientific organizations say this tug-of-war between politics and public health is also affecting AIDS researchers. The New York Times broke the story. Certain words can trip up AIDS grants. Words like sex workers, men who sleep with men, anal sex, transgender, and gay. Several researchers who rely on grants from the National Institutes of Health said they'd been warned by government health officials to clean up their grant applications. This document is at the center of the battle, a list of more than 150 scientists who study AIDS and human sexuality, applying for grants for research projects considered by some in Congress to be potentially offensive. It surfaced last October, just after this Washington hearing.
American Indian Transgender Research,
where NIH Director Dr. Elia Sarhouni was questioned about similar grants.
At the end, when they reviewed all these grants, there was scientific justification.
Meanwhile, Congressman Henry Waxman decided to look into the so-called hit list as part of his larger effort, Politics and Science in the Bush administration. He wrote to the Department of Health and Human Services, which oversees the NIH, after learning that officials within HHS may have helped draw up the list. And he asked Secretary Tommy Thompson to launch an internal investigation.
It is scientific McCarthyism for politicians to try to interfere with legitimate scientific research because they want to try to make that research go away or fit into their ideology.
Secretary Thompson sent back a strong denial, saying his department did not generate the document. At the same time, a conservative group known as the Traditional Values Coalition admitted it drew up the list. Still, nearly a year after that first letter to Health and Human Services, Congressman Waxman is not satisfied with the Secretary's response.
We have never had him come out yet, as far as I know, and condemn this interference in research and a hit list by a religious right organization.
But today, HHS says as far as it's concerned, the matter has been put to rest. Meanwhile, controversy at the CDC, which is moving ahead with a new initiative focusing on those who are HIV positive.
The epidemic has changed since 1981, and we have to change with it.
Dr. Valdesari says the new strategy is necessary because most new infections are coming from people who are infected and don't know it, so they're unknowingly spreading the virus. So millions of dollars are being pulled out of prevention efforts aimed at the general HIV-negative population, like condom distribution and clean needle programs.
Our overall HIV prevention budget is over $800 million. So you have to put $35 million in perspective compared to $800 million. The majority of our resources do in fact target high-risk seronegative persons.
Nonetheless, a year after our original story aired, Stop AIDS, like many other community-based organizations, no longer receives federal funding. And many are asking whether there's a common thread running through all three of these issues: the controversy over NIH research grants, the new strategy at CDC, and the investigations into groups like Stop AIDS.
I think it's completely unacceptable to have this sort of thing go on. I think we're going to lose very good scientists. We're going to lose our edge in scientific research. And I quite frankly think that millions of people may die if we don't get the answers to some of the questions that these researchers are looking at.
I'm Lynn Harris, and you're watching In the Life.
Still to come on In the Life, special rights.
I remember what it was like to feel powerless against the adult world.
The breakdown of the family unit.
How could it seem to anyone that it's better if it's just this one person than if it's two of us?
The homosexual lifestyle.
Just saying that you're gay, you're an activist right there.
And Harvey's take on his community's missing agenda.
We're like the biggest, messiest, most dysfunctional family that ever was.
The political struggle for the souls of schools frequently reaches beyond the classroom and into the personal lives of students. In Stranger Than Fiction, In the Life investigates the latest round in a 20-year-long battle over what literature young people should be allowed to read in their free time.
Young people, good to see you here this morning. You mark this one down especially.
Mommy told me something a little kid should know. It's all about the devil, and I've learned to hate him so.
God's word is clear. Homosexuality is an abomination.
So let the sun shine in, face it with a grin. Open up your heart and let the sun shine in.
Why are we labeling children by their sexuality?
As gay and lesbian people, we don't just suddenly become gay or lesbian when we hit college.
It's very possible to be 10, 11, 12 years old and know this is who I'm attracted to. And if you were living in a society where that was okay and you had a normal development, that's who you'd be.
I remember what it was like to feel on the outside. I remember what my body felt like. I remember what it was like to fall in love for the first time. I remember what it was like to feel powerless against the adult world, and all of that stuff just comes rushing back to me when I start writing.
I would say to mothers out there listening and fathers, it's time to do battle over your children.
84% of LGBT high school students regularly hear words like faggot or dyke on their campus. Over 91% of students hear the phrase, "that's so gay," used to describe something that their peers don't like or don't approve of frequently at their school.
I think that was the beginning of my calling, was saying to myself, you know what, I want to write a book that I haven't seen in the world. I want to see myself represented in the literature. I want to see my friends represented in the literature. I want to see, you know, now my kids represented in the literature.
I was a boy who was very different from other boys in many ways. I like to play with dolls. I like to dress up. And in my home, no one ever said there's anything wrong with who I was. But then there was this big outside world, and I got the message over and over and over that there was something wrong with me.
As a teenager, I pretty much stopped reading. And as I look back on it, I think part of that reason was because there weren't any books that spoke to me in terms of the huge issue that I was dealing with, and that was accepting my gay feelings.
This whole controversy about these books is about God and His Word. Are we or aren't we going to listen and obey the Word of God?
Is there a homosexual agenda in public school? Absolutely.
Part of what school's doing is preparing you to live in the real world. And in the real world, you're going to have to interact with LGBT people.
When you can get the minds and hearts of children, then you have a culture. Gay straight alliance clubs? Our children are being brainwashed.
Middle school, junior high, that's when the homophobic slurs really start kicking in. And at the same time, that's when young people are hitting puberty, 11, 12, 13 years old. And so they're having their first crushes, first kisses, first attractions, and oh my gosh, what if that attraction is to someone of the same sex?
We put a world on the page and we say, hey, look at this world. What do you think about it? And maybe give them a little bit of like what we think about it. Giving them the tools to start thinking for themselves.
Our children are being openly preyed on in public school, and we're not allowed to say anything, or we're homophobic, or we're mistreating, or we are haters.
When you go through school and you never see anybody like you in the books, you never see anyone like you in the videos, how can you possibly feel like you belong? And in fact, statistically, we know that students who have those kinds of positive portrayals are 27% more likely to say they feel like they belong at school.
I make those comparisons between, being an immigrant, being Latino, and being gay. In the same way we try to, hide or split off a part of who we are, and the damage that does to us.
When Black people entered the fiction with a book like Iggy's House, it was Black people's impact on white people. And so I was growing up believing that Black people can't tell their own stories, that it's only our impact on white people that can be told and published. And then, I read Sounder, which I hated because I didn't know what was wrong with the book, but I knew there was something that was very false about it. And then I realized these people are just totally depressed. They never touch each other. The only one in the book with a name is the dog. You know, the people don't even get named. And then I realized it wasn't written by a person of color. And I was like, okay, you know, this guy obviously does not know the Black community.
The difference between when I was growing up as an immigrant Mexican and growing up gay is that whatever issues I faced as a Mexican, as an immigrant, my parents, they were in the same boat. I could talk to them about that, and they were sympathetic to that. But growing up gay or lesbian, we're more isolated. Oftentimes we can't. We're too scared. The messages are too strong. Don't talk about this.
The most memorable experiences I have as a reader, that you have as a reader, are when we read something and something we've known to be true but have never had the words for, have never been able to quite figure out, just comes alive. We say, that's it. Now I understand that. I understand this about myself, or I understand it about the world, or something's so clear all of a sudden.
Jim's a very well-known middle school writer. Virtually every middle school teacher in the country teaches his books. And a few years ago, he came out with a book in which a group of young people themselves run to take over the student government on a platform for a no-name calling day. And they are the students who we know get called names in the schools.
It's about 4 best friends who are the misfits of the title, one of whom is gay, Joe, and who run for student council and ultimately decide to create a party called the No Name Party. GLSEN has taken this idea and run with it.
The purpose of No Name Calling Week is to simply raise the consciousness of teachers in middle schools and junior high schools across the country about the problem of name calling of all kinds based on sexual orientation, religion, race, ability, size, and to say, this week we're going to stop this.
GLSEN is one of the most radical homosexual advocates. They have Homophobia Week. They have days of silence where homosexual so-called children and kids talk about they're silent because they're supposedly so badly mistreated in public schools. Now, that's not to say that kids in public schools are not bullies. That's the favorite word right now. And don't use the word, oh, that's so gay. They do. I mean, they are very hard on anybody that seems strange. And nobody who wants things to be right would want that to be the case. But that does not mean that homosexual kids are being singled out.
There's so many ways we don't even begin to think about what words can do. And so often, not just with kids, but we'll hear adults say too, and teachers can easily overlook this kind of thing in school.
We think of censorship as someone going through with a pen and striking out certain sentences or phrases or scenes. And that's not the type of censorship that occurs with these books.
I remember going into the 51, the school in our neighborhood, and the librarian saying, can you not read from Melanin Sun? And, doing a free visit, doing it on my time. And I'm sure that goes across the country, that goes on, where people are like, no, these books are edgy, so we're not going to have them in our school.
Primarily for school libraries, there are three issues. There's the profanity issue, there's sexual content issue, and then there's sexuality themes, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender themes that can make some school librarians skittish. When I was writing the book, Rainbow Boys, the first one, it became very apparent, this is the book I wish I'd had, that I really wanted and needed to read when I was a young person. The book that would have told me, it's okay to be who you are. And just the power of that message, that just, I continue to hear that from young people.
One of the things that I found in coming out, and I did so late in life, is the realization of how much of my life I lived from fear. How wonderful it would have been to have some of the books that are out there now. It would have made a world of difference to me.
There's so much in this world about getting people to feel lesser than, and it starts so young. It starts with young people, and to try to figure out how to nip that in the bud somehow, to get them, to put some kind of road stop and say, no, wait a second, do not listen to this, do not ascribe to this, do not become who the world is saying you are. Don't let the world name you, is really important to me. And Literature is the way I know how to do it.
Many of this country's diverse LGBT communities have agendas of their own. For this month's Reel to Reel, In the Life looks at the most common gay agenda with the filmmakers of Treading Water, a documentary about the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness in rural Minnesota.
That's me, Dawn, with the big head. And that's Jamie. And that's us. We live in St. Paul, Twin City to Minneapolis. We moved here from Duluth 2 years ago. And I was confronted by city folks who wanted to hear the horror stories of living queer in rural Minnesota. I heard comments like, I didn't know you could be out in northern Minnesota. Were you scared? Is it really dangerous to be a rural queer? Treading Water started out as a project that we'd been talking about for years. We lived in Duluth and moved down to the Twin Cities, St. Paul, Minneapolis for work. When we moved down here, a lot of the metropolitan queers had a pretty solid idea of what northern Minnesota rural queer life was like. And mostly it was, boy, that was scary, wasn't it?
I've never been called a fag. I've never been called anything negative to my face. Yeah, people, there might be that out there, but I'm not aware of it because I've never had anybody confront me.
And I've never feared for my physical safety at all. And I think a lot of that has to do with that I don't really look queer. You know, like somebody looking at me wouldn't say, oh, for sure, she's queer.
Hardest thing about northern Minnesota is the closet factor, which is there's so many people who are in the closet or in a varying degree of the closet, and you run into them at Target or on the lake walk, and you don't know if you're allowed to say hello.
There is a lot of discrimination up here, not only against, gays and lesbians, but against people of color.
You are who you are because of what you've gone through in life, not because of where you decide to settle.
Sometimes people in a larger city think they have all the answers and that they have to come to the hinterland to explain how to do it. And they should really look at what can happen in a small town.
We were a little homesick and was like, oh, this is just giving us an excuse to go up every weekend and interview our friends and just make it for fun, And then the more we talked about it, the more it was like, wow, there's something here. These people have never talked on camera before, really. Let's try to get the individuals who, really don't have a voice out there.
We kind of started the film with the idea of let's look at Duluth, let's kind of dispel this myth of scary rural Minnesota. And then through the process realized that we had our own biases about places like the Iron Range, because the range has a lot of tough people. It's an iron mining industry. So we decided we should go out to the Iron Range and check out that area and look at our own preconceived notions of what it's like to be queer in a really rural setting.
The result is a living snapshot of LGBT life in rural northeastern Minnesota, with a wide range of individuals sharing their experiences of queer life in a small town. Individuals like Denise, a transgendered person who's dealing with acceptance and sexual identity. Lynn and Karen, a lesbian couple fighting for equal rights in the workplace. And Eric, an Asian American who reflects on racism and homophobia.
Remember the last physical fight I had was because someone actually told me to get back on the boat where I came from, which was just insane. And again, I think I've dealt more with that than with my sexuality. Probably because with my sexuality, I've made an effort to be honest and deal with people. And I'm probably less aware of the fact that I'm Asian, just because that's something that I've always been. I never feel like I have to, tell people. I mean, obviously, this is it.
We did focus on a few people more concretely, I don't know, than other people, mainly because, there was something about their story that people may not expect. Denise, a transgender woman, is an electrician, and she was accepted within her union.
For me, please understand, I've been this way all my life. I mean, I didn't even change, really. The only thing that changed to me, really, is that instead of having to hide who I was, that I'm really free to just tell anybody who I am now. And it's an incredible freedom.
As a man, she's married to a woman. Now she's a woman, but she doesn't want to get divorced, so does that make her a lesbian? How many layers you kind of unpeel that you don't know about, and you're like, wow, that's an interesting dynamic.
With like Lynn and Karen, We met them as a couple of gals from the range, and then these stories started coming out about their experiences working in the mines and all the steps they went through with sexual harassment within the mines, and how, you know, as lesbians, they were able to stand up for themselves in a way that the straight women in the mine didn't feel they could.
There was day-to-day confrontation because there was a lot of friction because we were two lesbians working at Mintac. And even though there were a tremendous amount of support from many of the workers that we worked with, there was a lot of tension as well.
Management decided, gee, we didn't get rid of these women. We can't have them integrated with the men. We're going to put them on their separate track gang. We're going to put all women on one gang, and then they can go behind and pick up spikes and hand them to the men, and the men can lay the railroad track while the women do women's kinds of work, like pick up the things and give it to them. And I said, absolutely no way. And they said, you're going to be suspended. And I said, so suspend me.
A lot of people were waiting for an opportunity to say something, you know, and we gave them that opportunity to tell their story. There's an interesting dynamic between the organized queers and the regular everyday queers, and I think everybody has their role, and you know, I'm so glad there are organizations like Out Front and Minnesota AIDS Project who can go out there and be very political. But I think it's often underestimated what your regular everyday person is doing within their own lives.
Just saying that you're gay or queer or GLBT, just saying it to one person, that you're an activist right there. And I think that's huge. And if you hear a bunch of people saying it, you know, then this is somewhat of a movement, I guess, and that it makes other people able to come out.
We told so many stories in Treading Water. There were so many stories in there. However, you know, cliche as it is, it was just the tip of the iceberg.
Singer-songwriter Catie Curtis has long lived her life her way, out and proud. But over the last year, as she and her partner have begun to raise a family, she's had to adapt her strategy. Tonight, In the Life goes backstage with Catie for a closer look at one homosexual's updated agenda.
I love this town. You can see the stars at night.
Catie has produced 5 albums that have carried listeners down a nuanced path of romance and relationships. Now Catie has completed her 6th album, and she has a new title which may or may not make it into the press. Mom.
When I was in college, I was really clear that I wanted to try making it as a musician somehow. When I graduated, and then that I would give it 5 years or so, and then see how it went.
Catie Curtis first burst onto the scene in 1996 with her hit album, Truth from Lies, a fitting title for a young artist who faced the decision to be, or not to be, out in her career.
At first I felt like, oh well, I'd probably be better off not being out. You know, this was like in the late 80s, early 90s. And then I started writing songs that were so clearly related to the gay experience that I didn't really have a choice. And I felt like, okay, if I'm gonna perform these songs and be myself, I'm gonna be out and I'll just have to see how it goes.
But I'm not being radical when I kiss you.
I was at that time signed to a major label, and they decided they were really gonna go with Radical as not only as the single, but also as a way to promote me as an out gay artist. And, you know, she's out, she's not afraid to talk about it.
I'm not radical when I kiss you.
Since she first burst onto the music scene, Catie has produced 5 albums that have carried listeners down a nuanced path of romance and relationships.
Slow train crossing the bridge over the Ohio River.
I would say, you know, 75% of my material ends up being about relationships.
Splitting her time between her long-term partner Elizabeth, her adopted daughter Lucy, and a whirlwind touring schedule, Catie has a lot to sing about.
Steady and strong, on and on, my love.
While balancing love and a career on the road was hard enough, 2003 proved the most challenging and rewarding year of all. Fortunately, filmmaker Rob Millis caught the year on tape for his documentary tangled stories.
As I began to shoot, she sort of mentioned that, oh, we're adopting a child, and could be any time now that we'll find out who the child is and where and be matched with her. Oh, and I also left my record label, too, this year, so I'm trying everything on my own for the first time in my career.
I signed with Vanguard, and we adopted a baby at the same time.
And suddenly, this became the biggest year of her life.
I am officially a mother. Yes, it's true!
My partner Liz has always thought that she would have a family and thought maybe she would like to get pregnant and have a baby. So it was more of her decision about whether she wanted to, go the biological route or the adoption route. And I was, I think, all along sort of pulling for adoption.
They decided to adopt, and Catie and Liz were eventually matched with the baby of their dreams, Lucy. But in order to bring her home legally, they had to confront a system that made Catie a silent partner.
It was really hard when we first filled out the paperwork for me to realize that only one of us could be on the paperwork. I think I was the most upset when we had to go to our friends and we had to go to people at work and ask for letters of recommendation for just the one person. Because I felt like, how could it be that it seems to anyone that it's better if it's just this one person than if it's two of us? And, it was very difficult to accept that, and I was very angry at the time.
Someday, I believe love will make an honest world for me.
When we went through this process of trying to adopt Lucy, and, it was very trying and very, required a lot of patience and faith because it kept seeming like it was going to fall through.
Well, there's a baby being born somewhere.
Once marriage is legal, either just in Massachusetts or throughout the U.S. someday, that's actually going to create some complications for people trying to adopt internationally, because if Liz and I were legally married when we tried to adopt internationally, we would have been denied. I remember walking through the airport with Liz and the baby, and Liz was worried that maybe I was freaking out. So she was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Liz, this is the best day of my life." Like, I just felt so high, like, oh my God, this feels so right. Here we are, like, we're 3 people now, and like, we're a tribe, and I'm really happy.
I've got something to give in this town where I wanna live. So what's the matter? What's the matter? All I ask is, why be afraid of this girl?
I think Ben opened the door to the awareness of gay persecution in Germany, because really, until then, it wasn't known and it wasn't admitted. Germany, before Hitler, was a mecca for gay life. It was wiped out in a second. It was wiped out in a second. So there is a lesson about taking freedom for granted. The other lesson is that they could wipe it out very easily, because while all of this freedom was going on, there was a law on the book that outlawed homosexuality. It was a dormant law. No one paid any attention to it. But the Nazis simply reactivated it. So it also means that one must really, really be very careful about what laws are on the book. And if people say, well, that law doesn't mean anything, you can't pay attention to that at all. You have to change that law.
And finally, In the Life's regular commentator and winner of 4, count them, Tony Awards, Harvey Fierstein tackles the homosexuals' lack of an agenda.
Oh, jeez. Are we ready? Getting all worked up. Oh, forget it. You know what the gay and lesbian community does best? Fight amongst ourselves. We're like the biggest, messiest, most dysfunctional family that ever was. We can start a war over a lisp. In fact, it's hard to imagine how we as a community get anything positive done. When I was a kid and first fell into the founding meetings of the GAA, that's the Gay Activist Alliance for you not old enough to remember the Partridge Family on its first run, just to get a meeting started was a skirmish. Who would speak first, lesbian or gay man? Who would set the agenda, lesbian or gay man? Who would represent us, lesbian or gay man or drag queen? In those early days, one of the biggest battles was whether to represent ourselves as heterosexual-esque or just as we are. There were gay men who believed if we wore white shirts and skinny ties like straight men did, we would be accepted. Likewise, our lesbian sisters were encouraged to dress less like Katharine Hepburn and more like Catherine the Great. And I ain't talking horse feathers. Beyond the what not to wear wars were how should we portray our goals? Should we politely argue that our rights are a matter of constitutional promise coming to fruition? Or do we scream, we're here, we're queer, get used to it, until we've drowned out our detractors and at last achieved our long overdue equal protection under the law? Religion has likewise been another sore spot for us. Do we stay in our family-designated houses of worship and accept that they are who they are and we need to accept them as such? Do we step gently out of the closet and quietly work for change? Should we found our own religious homes and shape them to our needs? Or is it best to desert these institutions altogether, leaving their pews empty and bankrupting their power to judge and dictate? I will never forget the gay civil rights bill hearings in downtown Manhattan, where priests, who certainly set off my gaydar, stood and testified against the passage of the bill. These pitiful creatures recited their superstitious lies, tears in their eyes, as we chanted, brother against brother, under our breaths. Oh, the ugly early days of freedom. And how about the LGBT community and our relationship to political parties? One would think that an involved, evolved, caring homo would only support candidates who support our issues. No way, Josephine. We have liberals and libertarians and conservatives and radicals. Our community populates the full rainbow of political affiliations and ideologies. Well, why wouldn't we? We come from the full rainbow of religious, ethnic, and socioeconomic spheres. We, in fact, have very little in common, despite our enemies' claims there's no such thing as a homosexual lifestyle or a homosexual agenda. Other than a broad orientation to partners of our own sex, we fully represent the panoply of sexual practices, desires, and expressions. No wonder our leaders are few and far between. Who could possibly represent such a faceted, factious, fractious community? How can one person speak for Mary Cheney, Larry Kramer, and the homeless transvestite who begs on the corner of 8th Avenue and 52nd Street? We have, in fact, very little in common, except for the desire to live our lives with dignity, privacy, sans threats to our personal being or pursuit of happiness. We have common goals, we have common history, and we share a common destiny. But is that enough to join us together? As a man without children, I've always resented paying exorbitant taxes to educate other people's kids. But are they other people's kids? Or are they the future of my country? And don't statistics tell us that 10% of those kids will grow up to be our kids? So I shut up and I pay the taxes. Another example. As a well-to-do capitalist, I profit dearly from the tax policies of the Republican Party. But is a $300 a year refund worth the aggravation of having those people in office? I donate much more than that to fight back their social agenda. So just voting them out of office would save me thousands in donations, not to mention time, energy, and agita. So what am I struggling to say here? We're great at disagreeing with each other. That's a given. But when we do, who wins? So instead of tearing into another tirade about how you would run the world, think it through. Put your ego and personal interests on the side and consider what's best for our community as a whole. Place the greater good before your personal opinions and take a look from that vantage. You might just see a rainbow.
I'm Alan Cumming, and from all of us at In the Life here at Phantom Audio in New York City, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next month.
Life is funded in part by the H. Van Ameringen Foundation. Additional support provided by the Ford Foundation, the Gill Foundation, the Pride Foundation, the Arcus Foundation, Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS, and the annual support of In the Life members like you.